And this professor was actually showing with images that they had already reduced it to practice. And so I recused myself from the vote on this one and said I need to recuse myself because I want this one. I want to throw my hat into the ring and spin this one off.
Hey everyone, it's Arick Wierson with Leverage Storytelling presented by Tunheim. Today I am joined by Michelle Bellanca, CEO and co-founder of Claros Technologies. Michelle, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk with you today.
Michelle, before we get into it, Claros is widely recognized as one of the world leaders in terms of PFAS destruction, but I just want to level set here because some people obviously are steeped in this issue. They understand what's going on with PFAS. Other people are waking up to this issue because there's been a lot of press about it lately. Can you just very succinctly, very high level, explain to people what are PFAS, how do they get here, what's Minnesota's role in PFAS, and why is it such a big issue, and why are so many people talking about it, and what does Claros do?
Let's break that question down into a couple of chunks, starting with what PFAS is. Your audience might be the most familiar with the common terminology where PFAS are called forever chemicals. The reason why they're called forever chemicals is they are considered as a class of compounds the toughest class of compounds to break apart. PFAS are made with a carbon-fluorine bond, and that's considered the toughest man-made bond to break, hence the name forever chemicals. These chemicals are in a number of products ranging from Teflon with DuPont and nonstick pans, nonstick surfaces, food wrappers from McDonald's that are nonstick that don't allow liquids to leak through them, all the way to 3M is the other big original producer with products like Scotchgard for waterproofing. Within this class of compounds, there's over 14,000, some say up to 15,000 different types of PFAS. That is very cutting edge new information for a lot of folks within the United States because the United States really focuses on a particular class of PFAS called the long chain. And those would be your PFOA, your PFOS. That's what DuPont and 3M originally used for Teflon nonstick pans and Scotchgard at the beginning when these compounds were invented in the 1950s. The applications are very far ranging for PFAS because they do have some pretty unique high value attributes to them, like the nonstick properties. And so you see them in applications, everything from cosmetics, where you're waterproof, that's mascara, your foundation that is sweat proof, to contact lenses because they don't stick to your eyeballs because they've got PFAS in them. Essential applications like semiconductors, they're used in 4 different places in that process. Medical devices, so your heart stents are coated with PFAS, implantables into your body are. Oil and gas uses it for a variety of different areas, including fracking. And so one of the key facets that we really should talk about here is not only is it a very large class of compounds, but there are applications ranging from essential to non-essential. Right? 70% of the applications out there for PFAS are actually deemed essential, meaning there's no known substitute today that can adequately replace what PFAS does for an application area that is considered really critical, like a heart stent into the body. Without PFAS in terms of coating that heart stent is not going to effectively work in the human body. So research dollars are being spent to try and find substitutes, but in many of these cases, that has not happened yet. And so when we look at this class of chemicals, one of the areas that you hear a lot about is, well, should we just outright ban them? And that's also not the solution.
Let's press pause for a second. We talked a lot about PFAS. I'm sure everyone's an expert out there right now. Everyone can sort of write a dissertation about PFAS based on Michelle's excellent description. But now let's talk about Claros. What does Claros do? Why is Claros sort of heralded as this sort of breakthrough technology in this space? What does it do?
At Claros, we focus in 2 areas. We focus on ultimately permanently destroying the PFAS in a proprietary process that we have, but we also have that go hand in hand with world-class analytical. Our motto at Claros is that you can't successfully destroy what you cannot accurately detect. And so, for your audience, think about it out there. If you've got 14 to 15,000 of these compounds, and in any type of process, they're being broken into smaller chain PFAS. An 8 chain gets broken into 2 4 chain. How do you know what you've accurately got in your water and what you accurately destroy without world-class analytical to be able to detect all of the different types of PFAS you have at the beginning of your process and what you're left with at the end? The holy grail of what Claros really does is we permanently destroy PFAS, all different types of PFAS, from the long to the short to the ultra short, to where there's no PFAS left. It's called total defluorination. At the end of the process, you don't have longer chains being broken into shorter chains. You've actually closed the loop and you've destroyed all of the PFAS. This is really important because part of what we all are focused on when we start to read about PFAS, because it is growing in the news these days, is, well, it's bad, we need to ban it. We really have to take a step back and say, what is the problem, right? There's really 2 buckets of problems. There's the perpetuation of the last 50 years of using PFAS, landfilling PFAS, incinerating PFAS, that has put it in the environment. And that is a hole that's already been dug, right? And that's an important remediation opportunity right there. The second bucket is the perpetuation of continuing to use these materials in industrial applications, whether it's pharmaceutical, it's oil and gas, it's semiconductor, where there are no deemed suitable replacements, but where today the PFAS and the wastewater is going out the back end of the facility unfiltered into the environment. That is where the problem gets stopped. If you dug a hole, stop digging, right? And so where Claros comes in is we squarely play in both of these buckets, but the biggest opportunity is stop the problem at the source. And what that enables us to do is to successfully limit the PFAS from leaving these industrial facilities, but allowing us to still use these materials for essential applications where you can basically have your cake and eat it too, right? We're using these materials where it makes sense for essential applications, but we are ensuring a closed loop system where their water that's leaving the facility no longer contains PFAS. That's how you stop the problem. The second place Claros comes in is working on groundwater remediation, et cetera, where we're cleaning up the problem that's already been created through landfills, through polluted groundwater, right? So both of those are opportunities that are massive markets. Where Claros's biggest claim to fame comes in is that, as you can imagine, most of these applications, there's massive amounts of water moving through these applications, and
you're talking about like industrial plants,
sure,
PFAS manufacturers,
right.
miscible wastewater systems,
right.
things like that, right?
So, imagine a producer of PFAS that's manufacturing it, or a textile company that's making Gore-Tex products that are waterproof that use PFAS materials. They've got a lot of PFAS that's leaving that facility in the back end of their wastewater effluent. If we can help them by managing that so that it never leaves the facility, then they can continue to use these materials for applications where there aren't suitable substitutes today, while not continuing to perpetuate the problem of polluting the environment with PFAS. I'm sorry.
Well, so I was going to say, but then why do you think that in Europe they're taking a much more aggressive stance on this issue? I mean, it seems like I read recently that there was like police raids on certain sort of chemical manufacturing plants. I know there's people picketing outside some of these chemical companies. I even saw something in the news recently that there was, I believe, some executives that are going to do some jail time for mismanagement of how they handled PFAS. And in this country, it's still like an issue that a lot of people haven't even heard about. So why that disconnect between Europe and the U.S.?
It's a great question, right? I think it's a $1 million question. I think it's somewhat complicated, Arick, but I think it ultimately comes down to, if you look at other areas, Europe tends to lead more heavily than the U.S. as far as leading edge in regulatory change, in health expectations and health change. I would say that the biggest pivot points in Europe have been, number one, public awareness and education, right? You have a public in Europe that is, they're discerning, they are aggressive, and they consider it their right. And so, as you mentioned, example after example, whether it's in the Netherlands or it's in Italy or other places, you've got big manufacturers, big users over there that for weeks at a time couldn't get into their facility because the picket lines of the public were so thick that they couldn't get through. You've also got massive groundswell that's lobbying and driving the individual countries or the EU to set regulatory, right? And so you've got regulatory awareness and public outcry all culminating at the same time in Europe.
At the same time here in the United States, we have almost the exact opposite. I mean, we have, obviously, I think in the previous administration, there was, I think, some attempts to sort of coordinate PFAS regulation to a certain extent at an EPA level. I think we're seeing a slight shift in that, or maybe even a little bit of a clawback when it comes to the Trump administration, which means then that the states are having to take the lead. And what we're seeing, from what I've gathered, is that it's a 50 state strategy. Minnesota is taking one approach, whereas, say, Texas or Florida might be taking an entirely different approach, right?
Right.
But we all breathe the same air. The water doesn't stop at the border. The aquifers. So it's really interesting because we're all in this together. But at the same token, each state is having its own approach to this problem.
Yes, very true. And each state not only is approaching it independently, but where they decide to squeeze is also different. So for example, Minnesota looks at it and we've got one of the most aggressive consumer laws now, in effect as of January 1,
Amara's
2025.
law, right?
Exactly. And what that does is it prevents any product that contains PFAS from being shipped into Minnesota, right? And that's great because all of a sudden you're putting education in the consumer's hands to say, hey, I was ordering a set of biking gloves, right? And I ordered them off of Amazon and I had no idea that they had PFAS in them. And I get flagged in Amazon saying we can't ship this product to Minnesota because it contains PFAS. That's
education right there, right?
Exactly. And it's education for the consumer who then in many cases says, well, wow, what is PFAS? Why can't that ship in? I want my biking gloves. That squeezes
Hopefully they Google PFAS and they watch this podcast.
Exactly.
Right?
That squeezes in one place, right? But your point of the states all acting independently is interesting because even though that's chipping away at the problem, it's not the total solution. And so then you've got other states like New Jersey, for example, that not only are doing something similar to Amara's law, but they're also saying we're going to go further than that. We need to stop the perpetuation of the problem in the first place. And it's not black and white banning this. It's looking at where's the biggest sources, continued sources for PFAS pollution that we've got in our state, right? And it's coming from a couple of places. It's coming from, number one, the big industrials that are making PFAS or using it because it's continuing to get into the water. You can ban consumer products all day long from entering your state, but if you're still making and using PFAS in high concentrations and it's leaving your facility into the water, that's not stopping the problem. So it's working with those industrials to set limits, like New Jersey, for example, is starting to do, to say you need to be under X parts per trillion when that wastewater is leaving the facility for PFAS. Otherwise, we're going to come down on your permits, right? We're going to minimize what you can produce or we're going to shut down what you produce. The other place that states like New Jersey are going is the second way that it's really perpetuating as a problem, and that is when you capture PFAS today, you're using sorbent materials called activated carbon and ion resin, and you're using those in your treatment train in these facilities, and then that spent material gets taken to an incinerator and it gets burned. And the challenge with that is when it's burned and it goes out the smokestack, you're taking the PFAS that's on that activated carbon or ion resin, and you're breaking that PFAS from longer chain into shorter chain in some cases.
Yeah.
Or you're taking that material, putting it in a landfill, and disposing of it that
You're not
way.
really destroying it.
No, and the challenge, and this is particularly relevant for us Minnesotan residents, right? Because we are really experiencing this problem firsthand because we've got incineration in the state of Minnesota, and we've got a lot of landfill here that is containing PFAS materials because one of the biggest PFAS manufacturers in the world is in our backyard.
Which would be
3M Corporation.
That's a company you know something about, right?
I do. I worked for 3M for close to 24 years before starting Claros. And so for Minnesota residents, we're experiencing and seeing firsthand how, yes, Amara's law is one step, but we've got to go further in terms of how do we avoid and minimize taking spent materials that capture PFAS and burn them or put them in landfill. And that's also circularly where we come back to Claros, right? Because if you can destroy the PFAS in line in a facility, then you're no longer needing these sorbent materials that are then landfilled and burned.
I alluded to your background, but let's just dive into that a little more because I think it's really interesting. So you're obviously you're from the East Coast, but you spent a good chunk of your professional life in Minnesota and then working for a Minnesota company overseas. Can you just bring us up to speed in terms of how you got to the role you're in today?
Sure. It's a little bit circuitous. So out of undergrad, I grew up in Virginia on the East Coast, not Virginia, Minnesota. Because a lot of times when I say Virginia, people think
they do, huh?
I'm Minnesota born. And so grew up in Virginia, out of undergrad, took a job for the Japanese government in Tokyo, Japan. So I worked in Japan for the Ministry of International Trade and Investment. Did that for a couple of years, and then I went back and did my first grad stint. Then worked for IBM, and then subsequently, after my second grad stint, I applied at a job fair for a job at 3M. I was close to accepting a job with another company out of business school, and decided to apply for 3M because one of my dad's best friends worked for 3M and he loved it. Made it into one of the final interview rounds where I was brought to Minnesota. Never thought I'd live in the Midwest, and I fell in love with the company, with the technology. I felt like they had so many different technology platforms. That's what 3M is known for, like micro-replication, which is used in a variety of products from sandpaper to the griplets on golf gloves. And I thought I would never be bored working for this company. And so I took a flyer and accepted a job with 3M and moved to the Midwest. And that was the start of my career at 3M. So I was at 3M for about 24 years in a variety of different positions. The expectation for most MBAs at the time coming into 3M was the holy grail was getting to run a multi-billion-dollar business like 3M Healthcare or Scotchgard or Post-it Notes. And so, I did my time, went through the baking process, went through a variety of roles in the company, managed big businesses, particularly in healthcare, in specialty materials. And then really my passion was on the front end. And so I was very fortunate in that I was able to take a newly created job working for the CTO of 3M at the time to look for external tech platforms to buy and bring in to 3M to really help complement the organic growth. And that was where I was bit with the bug on the venture side. Started a couple new businesses, and then one was quite successful. That business moved me to Singapore with 3M to shift the center of gravity for that electronics business to Asia. So I did that in Singapore for about 2.5 years, and then moved over to the corporate venture side. So I ran 3M's corporate VC for APAC for the last 8 years. So about 10.5 years in Singapore with 3M. And it was from that last 8 years of running their corporate VC that I really fell in love with the the startup side. And so I was faced with that, probably a challenge that I think many entrepreneurial stories tell, where you've got this great job, great company, safer, let's say, predictable, or you can take the other fork in the road, which is jump off the cliff. You have no idea where it'll go. I hadn't picked or found a tech platform yet. I had no idea what kind of company that I wanted to leave to start. But I just knew that I would have regret if I didn't take the chance. I get asked a lot of times, why did you leave? Did you not like it? And the answer is absolutely no. I don't think that we as Claros, or me as a leader at Claros, would be where we are without the experiences that I had at 3M. I just knew that I would regret it if I didn't try it, even if it failed spectacularly.
And then, so tell me about that process. So you left 3M, and then you saw technology at the University of Minnesota, right? And then that was sort of at least the precursor to what is Claros today, right?
Right. It's actually a little bit funny because it just shows that life's not predictable, right? Like, I always had this view as a kid that decisions were binary, right? They were either good or bad. Like, there was only one way across the river of life, right? And the stones were already set. I didn't have this appreciation that when you stepped on one stone, maybe 6 would appear. And that out of the 6, there were a variety that were right. So, if I look at where I was at 3M and leaving and the predictability, I would have never predicted that in our backyard we would find the technology platform that we did to start Claros. So I sat on a couple of boards in Singapore. So Singapore within the global world is very well respected on the early tech side of things. They're considered like the Silicon Valley of Asia. So I was on the Spring board there, the A-Star board. And then I started participating in the Office of Tech Commercialization at the U of M, their decision committee on what to do with technologies coming through the various schools at the U. Is it a technology that you want to spin out, you want to license, or you want to kill? Like, where does the decision tree go? And so I was looking on the West Coast for a startup nugget, the essence of what could be a company in the tech space. I was looking on the East Coast, and then as a favor agreed to sit on this committee. And literally probably 6 months into it, if I back up a little bit, people tease me, but when I decided that I wanted to follow my dream and look for a company and do a startup, I resigned from 3M while I still lived in Singapore with my family. And so I get teased because I didn't wait until I came home, and I didn't have a job to go to, right? And so the next day, reality sunk in of like, all right, what am I going to do while I'm trying to find this tech platform? And so I consulted to companies, and 3M was a great client during that time. So then scroll ahead to where while I'm consulting, I agreed to participate in this committee. And it was months in, I got a call from a friend saying, I just saw something at the U that you have to go check out. And I'm like, no, I'm on this committee. And then the way the universe always serendipitously works, in one of the next committee meetings, the professor that this friend of mine had said, you've got to go check this out, presented to the committee
I see.
this technology. And basically he had already reduced to practice what they could do in this space of tunable sorbents, for example, which is the capture precursor to PFAS destruction. And so when that came up for vote, I had the advantage of 3M had looked at several companies trying to do this, and none of them were deemed far enough along. And this professor was actually showing with images that they had already reduced it to practice. And so I recused myself from the vote on this one and said I need to recuse myself because I want this one. I want to throw my hat into the ring and spin this one off. And so that was 2017.
Now, a lot of people probably don't realize this, but like, it's probably a crass analogy to say this, but there are these sort of shopping malls for ideas, right? At universities.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people don't realize that if you go to, we talked about the University of Minnesota, if you go to Stanford, MIT, Harvard, all these places, there are lots of technologies that are just looking for a place to go to market, right?
They are. It's how do you insert yourself in the traffic at the most optimum places to be able to scan for those, right? It's like fishing. There's big fish in the river. How do you find those fish, right? It's not just sticking your pole in the water. You've got to figure out where are the sweet spots, where do you need to be. And the University of Minnesota is great. I think along those lines, not enough people in Minnesota recognize the institution in the University of Minnesota we have in our backyard. I didn't, right? But their engineering school, for example, is one of the tops in the country. The ideas and the inventions coming out of many of these schools within the University of Minnesota are top notch, right? And so it is a proud moment. Like today, I was on a panel for Governor Walz, and it's a proud moment to be able to say the essence of our company, the kernel that started our company, came out of the University of Minnesota, right? That's pretty cool. The PFAS materials in part and the challenge and the problem created with them came out of a local company in 3M. The solution to clean them up is coming out of a local company in Minnesota. And the founding essence of that company is from the University of Minnesota.
So fast forward to today. Where's Claros right now in terms of its evolution as a company?
You know what? It changes depending on the day you ask me. That's how fast it is right now. I feel like we just had a board meeting the other day, yesterday actually, and the materials were sent out a week ago. And I found myself in the board meeting apologizing because we had significant updates since the materials were sent out a week ago. So that's my preface to saying what I'm telling you now. There might be further updates before the podcast airs. We are right now in the stage of going from, we've got our product, our MVP. It's more than a minimally viable product. We've got our PFAS destruction solution. It's the reactor with all of the peripherals that go with it, that hit the performance goals that the industries need, flow-wise, economics-wise, performance-wise. We've got those systems developed. We've got many pilots now with the big companies under our belts, and we're moving right now from pilot execution to commercial scale this year and into next year. So this is, I would say, one of the biggest inflection points in the company to date is what we're living right now. Our main customers are industrial. That's our sweet spot first application market segment. It's these big makers of PFAS and the big user industries of PFAS. Your textiles, your healthcare, your semiconductor, oil and gas. Those companies where those facilities are running 24/7 making PFAS and or using it in applications. And so where we are is, we're now in with over 10 of the top 12 biggest PFAS makers in the world, because we're right at the cusp of converting number 11. And then we've got many, many large user of PFAS customers. And so we're piloting in their facilities right now in Europe, Japan, and the United States. And then for some of those companies, for example, one of the two largest PFAS makers in the world that's one of our lead customers, we're in the process of the final pilot that optimizes the actual system that they will then commercially implement, that we're on track to implement with them early next year.
And how big a market is this? What are we talking about?
just within the United States alone for PFAS remediation, just the remediation. So not the consulting services or the peripherals, well over 200 billion.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I've heard, globally, I've heard the $1 trillion thrown around, the $1 trillion number thrown around, in terms of the size of the problem as well, right?
Yes. Yes.
And trillion's an interesting word too, because also that's one of the, I think, the hardest things about getting people to understand this issue, because when you're talking about parts per trillion, it just kind of rolls off the tongue, but parts per trillion really means like basically one drop of something within like 20, 30 Olympic sized pools, right? I mean, it's very, very small, amounts we're talking about.
Right. Right.
And so you're talking about an issue that's very hard to see, very hard to imagine, but with massive economic impacts and repercussions.
Totally correct. And with limited information out there, right? So once again, I'll bring it back to this theme around PFAS, 14,000 different ones, long, short, and ultra short. In Europe, they are very aware of all the way down to the ultra short. And so when they do analytical to determine, hey, what's in that water? What's in that soil? Because my food is coming from that soil. They're testing in parts per trillion, the long, the short, and the ultra short, because that's on their radar screen. That's how they define PFAS. We in the United States, when we test, we're not necessarily testing for all 14,000, right? We're testing for the ones that we define as PFAS, right?
Right.
And so you've got what's best and what you're looking at from an industrial situation, and you've got what's best for us as consumers, right? What's best for us as consumers is to have the same level of awareness as Europe, right? As we're analytically testing for that one drop of PFAS, parts per trillion in 30 Olympic-sized swimming pools. If that's directly correlated to being very hazardous to my health, I want that to be accurate. And I want to know not just if I have long chain in my drinking water or my soil food source. I want to know if I have short and ultra short, right? That's where analytical testing becomes really important. And so we at Claros like to say that if you look at, have we reached the tipping point in PFAS remediation, in the demand for knowing this isn't a problem that's going to go away and that destruction is the solution of choice. One of the best leading health indicators of this market is analytical. It's because you can't even wrap your head around destroying something that you can't even detect. So for example, we have world-class industrial companies that have come to us attorney-client privilege thinking they had a PFAS problem, or knowing they did with 2 PFAS chemicals, that after the world-class analytical lab testing at Claros found out they had 11 PFAS within their water.
Luckily, they came through attorney-client privilege, right?
Yes.
So they don't have to, doesn't trigger disclosures, right?
Right. Which is something that's attractive to many of our clients because they want to know they have a problem. They want to be able to figure out how to resolve their problem, but they want to be able to do it in a confidential manner. And the importance of that point there is they came, they wanted to do something about it. They thought they needed to remediate around a couple. Then, to your point about the accuracy of analytical, they were eyes wide open, surprised. Wow, our problem's not a couple. Our problem's a lot.
So I would imagine that at all these different companies you're dealing with, unlike, I guess, the usual suspects would be the plant managers and then the C-suite, but probably it's like the chief legal officers who really, have their feet being held to the fire on this thing, right?
I'm smiling because you're absolutely right, and we didn't appreciate that until not that long ago, because we've been fortunate in that we've been able to attract a lot of the big makers and users, the industrial companies as our customers, just by word of mouth. But recently, we started, now that we filed a lot of our IP and we're coming above the radar, you'll see more on Claros. So I would say to your audience, please be on the lookout for us. Check out our LinkedIn page, support us. But until, then we were below the radar. Now that we're coming above, we're trying to figure out where do you go in the world out there that's going to be the most relevant for bringing the right kind of awareness with the companies that we can potentially help. And it's these regulatory legal conferences. So, we'd been trying to get into two of the largest makers in the world for a couple of years. And they were the two holdouts that we haven't been able to tap into. And I presented at the New York Regulatory and Legal PFAS Conference. And between that one and one that our chief legal officer did in Europe, both of those companies came into the Claros fold, right? But it's your point. It was through the chief legal officer, because these companies either are already litigating and fighting civil, criminal charges, right, in any part of the world, not just the United States, particularly Europe.
Or they're gaming out the regulations, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or they want to future-proof their business, right? These companies are hearing directly from work with the EPA, for example. If you can showcase that you can keep your effluent levels at a very, very safely deemed level for PFAS effluent coming out of the back end of your facilities, will allow you to continue using it. We will consider providing you an exemption. And so these companies understand that if they want to continue using PFAS, if they do the right thing and they prevent it from leaving their facility, they may be able to do both, to continue using the materials while also satisfying state requirements.
Which gets back to
or
the early
federal.
point about these essential use cases. But in many cases, as you said earlier in the podcast, you can't live without some of these PFAS. You have to be able to live with these PFAS because so much of modern technology, modern society depends on them. And so therefore you need to be able to deal with them responsibly. And I think that's what's so interesting about finding out how do you deal with something. I don't want to call it a necessary evil because they're doing things you mentioned, heart stents. These are miraculous sort of things of technology. But at the same token, you have to be responsible at how you deal with that wastewater, that effluent.
Exactly. And part of what we look at Claros is our goal is to be the most effective, highest performance, most economical, so that we can incent as many of these companies out there to do the right thing. Not because they're being sued, right? But because it's also a complete closed loop solution. It works and it's economical, right? If we can price competitively and go head to head with incineration, head to head with landfill, right? Then that's also helping to stop the problem, right? And so, we're fundraising right now. We have in the past. We're heading into our Series B. And one of the questions that we get a lot is, well, could you price higher? And we're already attractively priced and from potential investors. And the answer is yes. And it depends on the market segment, right? But yes, in some cases, we could go even higher. But is that the right move? Because doing right by the environment and making a financial return can go hand in hand. And if we've got attractive profit margins and at the same time we're able to incent massive companies that have a really big footprint that are making essential products that need PFAS, and we can ensure we're keeping it out of the back end of their waste effluent that's going into rivers and the environment, and we can do that economically, that causes companies to switch that otherwise might not switch, that's important, right? And that is something that drives Claros, and we're very fortunate because we have a board that looks at big picture, right? Beyond solely the financial return.
Michelle, this has been absolutely fascinating, and I want you to promise one thing. You said your company is evolving so quickly. Next year, I want to have you back on the podcast and talk about. I'm sure we're going to have a completely different conversation because your business and the market is just sort of expanding miraculously. Thanks so much for being on here.
Thank you very much for having me, and I'll look forward to coming back next year.
For Leverage Storytelling, I'm Arick Wierson. We'll see you next time.